This week, inflatable frogs took to the streets to tell Donald Trump they were hopping mad.
Some Republicans branded today's protests a Hate America rally.
Do you see hate here? It's all about love. We love America. We hate who's in office right now.
Many chose to wear costumes to show they meant no harm. There were Uncle Sams, bears, dinosaurs, squirrels, and plenty of Donald Trumps.
Some No Kings protesters speaking to 9 News Australia on Sunday. Arion, what's the story?
Yeah, so over the weekend you had this really colourful array of inflatable costumes that appeared amid the huge crowds of demonstrators around the US and around the world, actually, who were taking part in the No Kings protests against Donald Trump. There were characters of all kinds. You had frogs and hot dogs to Santa Clauses and T-Rex dinosaurs. And the costumes have kind of come to be this rather absurd symbol of the pushback against the perceived excesses of the Trump administration. And loads of people across the US are putting them on as demonstrations of their resistance to, particularly two things, both Trump's deportation policies and also his domestic military deployments, and in some kind of the ways in which Donald Trump is starting to behave not like a traditional president, but more like a tyrant or a king, hence the No Kings rally name.
Okay, yeah, but how do you explain all of that whilst dressed as a dinosaur?
Well, that's the funny thing, that in a way, part of what they're trying to do is they're pushing back against Republican portrayals of the events as these hate America rallies. That's how Republicans are attacking them. That's their kind of attack line to come at the protesters and make them seem insignificant. And what they're doing is they're saying, look, how can we be these Antifa super soldier thugs if we're dressed in these fluffy, silly costumes? So it's kind of it's this means to puncture the absurdity of the suggestion that they are violent thugs through an absurd display that's just completely silly to look at.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me, Jamie, a little bit of Trigger Happy TV, some of the footage that I was seeing, because there were ICE officers, if that's what we call them, detaining, if that's the right verb, some of these guys who were dressed as, like, you know, Mr. Potato Head. And there's something, I mean, it's scary because in the clips that I saw, all they were doing was expressing their freedom of speech. I mean, who knows what else was going on? But from what I could see and what was spread on social media, they were being detained purely for that. But it was inherently amusing because you have this contrast between the way the officers are dressed, you know, tooled up to the nines and their big helmets and everything, and these guys wearing ridiculous costumes. It's sort of inherently funny.
Yeah, this is actually really... I mean, I've seen the same videos, the one of the frog being pepper sprayed, absolutely mad. This one is really difficult for me to come down on either side for, because I think there is an argument that it does trivialise the gravity of the issues. You know, dressing up as a dinosaur or a banana, it kind of distracts a little bit, which I guess is what they're trying to say. But is the message being lost a little bit by the fact that they're dressed like this? And the protests that I've been on, I can't imagine turning up as an inflatable frog to that or anything, and people not turning around and being like, "Are you taking the piss?" Like, I kind of think they're not doing it yet, but there is an element to be like, if you're not understanding the nuance and the message, and like, bloody hell, people struggle with nuance in the 21st century and in the world that we live in today. If you're not understanding the nuance behind what the message and the demands, you're going to look at that and think, like, these are just a bunch of jokers. Why should I take them seriously? So I do have that, the optics of it. I have that worry that's like, I understand the point, but I also am there like, are you guys kind of missing the idea?
You're nodding, Harriet.
I think all of that is really legitimate, but on the other hand, if the administration is trying to frame these protesters like super soldiers and therefore scare people from coming and joining in the protests, I do think that this is a very good way to subvert that effort. I also think the broader picture, and it's something I kind of in my head refer to as like the Trump spider web, which is the administration, the podcasters, the influencers, the social media network that they control. The Trump spider web dominates the internet. I mean, they dominate most of the information ecosphere. they are masters of the viral and they are masters of social media in a way that opposition has not been. And I think what's interesting about this is it seems to me a step in the right direction of you do need to grab people's attention. And these viral clips showing like sort of dancing inflatable dinosaurs in the face of like heavily militarized agents is so eye-catching, and they are spreading across the internet, and it is a good strategy from a PR perspective. It's getting significantly more visual grasp of the internet.
Yeah, and also, at least according to some of the protesters on the ground, it's helping to keep things civil. One of the Portland-based streamers, a guy called Brooks Brown, who co-founded a group called Operation Inflation, which collects funds so that they can get more of these free inflatable suits and hand them out, had a quote that he was talking to the New York Times, I think, and he said, when you have the inflatables, everyone starts dancing, and even the people who are very serious, they continue what they're doing. They're disciplined, but they're not very angry. And I think that in a very tense situation when, as we know, America has become so polarized, to get this kind of undercurrent of silliness to diffuse a situation that could otherwise turn very violent, and also, you have these heavily armed officers on the streets. That seems like just a simple way to make sure that at least the protests don't end in the worst possible way. It seems sensible on that level alone.
I mean, I guess, Jamie, when you compare it against the great protests of American history, people lining up for civil rights and Dr. King and all of that, the idea that in the future, in the annals of history, you'd open up whatever the equivalent of Encyclopedia Britannica would be and see a load of campaigners dressed as Mr. Potato Head seems completely undermining of important, historical events.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the point that Arion just made is very compelling as well about, and also just about getting more people involved. The idea that if you are going to have a dance and a fun dressed up as Mr. Potato Head, it maybe is going to be more persuasive to get people out on the street on a message that they actually think and care about, than if you're saying I'm going to go and potentially get, kettled or whatever on. But I take the point that you're making, Ollie. I guess it is incredibly symbolic and symptomatic of the times that we live in. That there's a kind of now an aesthetic technological literacy that protesters have, that they understand the concept of viral moments and social media friendly visuals, that actually this is the skill of modern activism, of how you kind of gain organizing power is by creating these images. And I see Harriet's point about the way that they've taken over the internet, and maybe this is kind of fighting fire with fire. It does also mean that maybe there's more scope for more interesting, more fun. I know a lot of the time people get kind of like protest fatigue or march fatigue. Particularly, I know with the Palestine protests, I've heard about that thing of like, is there ways to make this a longer lasting, because this stuff is going to happen quite, for a long time. Is there a way to get kind of longer lasting activism by making it more aesthetically pleasing, but also more enjoyable to be a part of? Yeah.
It can be motivated by anger, but not feel as angry, I guess.
Well, yeah, I think it's also, this is not the first massive anti-Trump protest. Like, millions of Americans have been protesting against Trump and his administration's actions since 2016, like for nearly 10 years. I remember very clearly the Women's March against Trump and, the pussy hats and stuff, and that was a very memorable moment. But people have been protesting Trump for nearly 10 years. And so when you're talking about the annals of the history books, and you're talking about all the millions of people that have sustained that opposition for nearly a decade, I don't think it's fair to say that this is the only defining moment, or will be the only. It doesn't seem to undermine the gravity of the situation, because this administration, their whole purpose, their whole aesthetic and their whole vibe is cruelty. It's the reveling in the cruelty, and it's the reveling in the violence and the fear and the stoking of hatred. And it seems to me to be quite an effective visual way to combat that, with something that looks so absurd and pokes a hole because they do say that the best way to combat that sort of thing is to kind of make fun of them and make them absurd.
Yes.
And it is absurd to watch an adult in an inflatable frog costume stand up against a guy with a big gun.
Yeah, but a Republican wouldn't say that. I mean, a Trump-supporting Republican wouldn't say that their modus operandi is cruelty, would they, Arion?
They would probably
that their
admit
modus
that
operandi
it's fear.
is taking things seriously and being hard on the issues that matter to people, and clamping down is what you voted for. And this visually sort of suggests that you were right to do that. Like Jamie was saying, look at these jokers. We're the only ones taking this seriously.
Yes, and, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt came out on X and said, if you think this is crazy, pointing to an image of naked bikers outside Portland's ICE facility, she said, congratulations, you're a Republican. And I think that sense of, motivating people to join MAGA by virtue of the fact that the other side is not serious, there is a potential threat there. Though I do think that if, looking at an image of someone in a frog suit at a protest is the thing that tips you over into MAGA-dom, then you are probably 99% of the way there anyway. But I think even though, just coming back to that point about the fact that frog costumes that are inflatable and their impact on social media might be very of its moment, I think this does sort of fit into the great long history of satire in politics. And you think about Count Binface and the raving monster loony party, and then through to Zelensky, who started his career as a person pretending to be the president in a comedy show and then became the president of Ukraine, and Beppe Grillo's 5-Star movement in Italy, right back through to, you could take it back to the Middle Ages, where you had kind of fools and performers and jesters being the people who could speak truth to power. I think there is, and long has been, a way that you can use humour to lambast the worst excesses of the age, and I think this is possibly the latest iteration of that.